World Affairs Roundup next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Today we'll be looking at Countdown in Iran. As the annual commemoration of the fall of the Shah approaches, the regime in Tehran is trying to prevent the event from being appropriated by the opposition Green movement. Executions of protesters have occurred, with more promised to follow. Meanwhile, opposition leaders are calling their supporters to the streets. How far are both sides prepared to go? Asian amity. Despite assurances to Washington, Prime Minister Yukio Hatayama's efforts to deepen ties with China have some American policymakers worried about waning U.S. influence in the region. Has our longtime Japanese partner developed a roving eye? Bolivarian blues. Amid a backdrop of worsening economy and growing dissent, Venezuelan President Hugo Chaves closed yet another media outlet critical of his administration. Will this and similar moves strengthen his grip on power or spell the end of his Bolivarian revolution? Summit snub. President Obama set off another diplomatic row with European allies when he announced he would skip the EU summit next May. Insult was added to injury when the leaders first learned of the decision through press reports. What's behind this busy signal in the transatlantic dialogue? For a closer look at these stories, we're joined once again by John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamiliton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back, everyone.
Pleasure to be back.
Well, John, maybe we could start with you and the situation in Iran. What messages are being sent by both sides in this run-up to February 11th?
Can I start with a generalization about all the topics that we're talking about
Sure.
today? And I looked at them, and all of them have a piece of atmospherics about them. But if you only were to look at that, you would really miss the importance of all of these events. And if we talk about Iran, we're talking about the commemoration of the takeover from the Shah on February 11th. Well, but deeper than that is the level of the demonstrations, the role of the presidential candidate Mousavi in terms of whether he is merely now challenging the administration or is seeking to change the whole system itself. And those are important questions. Also, related to this is Iran's official inflation rate now is at 13.5%, although most suggest that it is probably double that. This eats into the regime's basic support group, the poor, the workers, the rural population. And then there is factored into this is the confrontation with the West. And I say the West because China and Russia probably are not part of this confrontation. It's more the U.S. and the EU who lead this challenging of Iran's interest in developing nuclear weapons. So I would say there are a number of factors behind all of this. How it's going to turn out I think is going to be a much longer period of time than just the February 11th event.
So, Ann, what about this? How big of an upheaval is the opposition really seeking to precipitate here? Is this, initially it was we would like a recount of the election. Now has it evolved into something more?
Well, there have been a whole series of protests. I mean, it started before the election on June 12th and has continued since then. And it turned violent pretty quickly, but it continues to be violent. There were 8 deaths in demonstrations on the holy day Ashura, just on December 27th, including the nephew of Mousavi. So, and there have also been executions, which are an important part of this. And some of the response that's Mousavi has issued a really interesting statement saying that the right to protest was, of course, part of the revolution, and be highly, highly critical of the regime, suggesting that they're on their way to an even darker dictatorship than under the Shah, and making statements calling the leader of Friday prayers a brutal, ruthless individual who didn't understand the power of innocent blood. And Mousavi and Karoubi, another opposition leader, are calling for people to come out. And it's all out on the web, so that it's out there.
Well, and Robert, what about this idea of, the revolution not living up to its original promises? I mean, is that a difference between calling for a new revolution and calling for sort of the completion of the one that's already taken place?
Well, it's very important to understand that this is a battle for the legacy of the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution. It is not, some Westerners would like to see this as they want to go and become a liberal democracy. That is not what the discussion is. Mousavi was a hero of the original revolution. He is accusing Ahmadinejad and the supreme ruler of essentially violating the principles of the revolution. So this is framed as a restoration project. And he is saying that constitutional rights, the right to free speech, democracies are part of that revolution, part of that legacy. So he has escalated. He is now testing them to the point where he could be arrested. I mean, they don't want to arrest a hero of the revolution with his standing, who was one of the nominees for president and may have had the election stolen from him. But he has now said that they are fundamentally illegitimate, that they are violating the principles of the revolution. The revolution has failed because they are leading it. And so that is a huge challenge to this regime. If they try to ratchet it up further, then it becomes even more of a dangerous situation. But that's what they've done so far. They've gotten more and more repressive step by step, but it escalates and raises the stakes. I think that even though there's been a lot of violence, it's been mostly still from the state, from state security forces. The Green Movement has been remarkably peaceful. In fact, in the Islamic world, this is a lot closer to the kind of peaceful protest movement that overthrows regimes than what we see, for example, among the Palestinians, where the violence of the movement has undermined its international credibility. So I think the Green Movement is an extremely formidable opposition. It has a lot of legitimate support, and I think the regime is delegitimizing itself by its attempts to repress it. And Mousavi is proving to be connected to moving, in fact, towards the more radical elements of the opposition at this stage.
But do we have a clear sense of what the leadership, to the extent that there is one of the Green Movement, is asking of its followers? I mean,
my understanding is that the opposition is not in disarray, but is certainly not united in terms of what their goals are or how to put this all together. It brings in secular as well as religious figures, and therefore finding common cause is much more complicated. And also, you have to look at Iran from the leadership point of view, that they feel that they're almost on a war footing. They're fighting with the West over the nuclear issues. They are involved in a number of related kinds of exercises in Iraq and in the Persian Gulf, supporting Shia groups within there. There is a religious movement that is feeding off into these other areas, and so there is a sense of purpose on the part of the leadership that is, I would suspect, frustrated by this opposition that they're finding at home.
So, what should we look for on February 11th? I mean, what are some key things to be aware of?
Well, I think that the opposition is, as John said, it's not. I mean, at least we don't see evidence of it being united in the terms of its goals. But I do think that they do have the speeches and all that they're making, the statements that they're putting out indicate that they do want to convince the people that their rulers now are not serving them, and that they need to respond in a popular movement, and they're calling people out to the streets. And given how this has moved since the election and even before, I would imagine that a lot of people will be out on the streets, and that we will likely see violence. Now, where that will lead, I don't know.
Well, Robert, I think if we can go a bit further east to Japan and see what the new administration there is up to with regard to China. Is this a sea change in Japanese foreign policy?
Well, it certainly is in the atmospherics of it. I like John's original framing of our discussion. the previous Japanese ruling party, which ruled for many decades, would tweak China on major issues between them, such as the Japanese incursion into China, and cause a lot of, and so there were quite frayed relations, quite frankly, between the two societies. This has been described to some extent with the new administration that's been brought in mostly as opposition, simply as a rejection of the corrupt status quo, as a rapprochement with China. It's hard to say. There's a lot of symbolism about that, but it's hard to say what it will lead to as far as a concrete change in foreign policy. It's also being framed in terms of the whole kind of decline rhetoric about the United States, and therefore the rising China rhetoric, which is in a lot of foreign policy discussions. It's hard to know. I mean, there's no question that over time China is becoming more significant and the United States is not as hegemonically powerful as before. But I think there's an overstatement of this. So every time any country like Japan starts making moves towards working more with China, then all of a sudden it fits into this rhetoric about about the decline of the United States and the rise of China. I think it's much too early to tell. It's actually very hard to tell whether this administration will be a permanent rulers of Japan. This might be a very temporary rejection, and then there'll be a return to a coalition closer to the traditional coalition that has ruled Japan. But there is something going on here as China grows more powerful. Japan is going to have to, as becoming the second largest economy in Asia, is going to have to reposition itself in terms of China. But China is very difficult to deal with, and will be just because of their approach to foreign policy, and because of it, quite frankly, China has very grand aspirations as far as restoring its position as certainly the middle kingdom in Asia, at least, and probably beyond.
Well, there's a historical reference for you. John, how important are some of the historical conflicts between the two countries?
Well, they mostly come out of World War II. If you go back further, China had been somewhat of a protector of Japan in historical terms. First of all, if you look at the current prime minister in Japan, when we did a program on that, if you'll remember, maybe some of our viewers will recall as well, in which we talked about this guy being a wild card, that he was likely to do things that were rather unusual. But there is also a basis to some of what he's talking about. First of all, China has replaced the United States as Japan's most important trading partner. Mm-hmm. So it's not unusual that they would make gestures in that direction. Looking at it from the Chinese point of view, the Chinese have a national security policy that is seeking to take advantage of the 2 decades while the U.S. and Russia is weakened and the U.S. is preoccupied elsewhere, to be able to build a strong economic engine. Part of their strategy is to reassure the countries around them in their periphery that they don't have hostile intentions toward them, that there are, and this would be seen from the Chinese point of view as a natural extension of that strategy.
Well, we've got other roads to take and other continents to visit, but first we're going to take a short break. Our viewers will be right back with more International Focus.
Our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with John Katzka and Hamiliton and Robert Kraig. And maybe you could start us off on the situation in Venezuela. There were protests around Hugo Chaves' closing of another media outlet. Mm-hmm. And how serious is the dissent at this point to his administration?
Well, it's definitely gotten a lot more serious. For the first time, his public opinion poll numbers are below 50%, which is really significant. And there were protests to the closing of this. The radio, the station had been closed before, but it had been operating from a cable from Miami. And they have this law saying that all networks have to, and cable networks have to, cede time to the president whenever he wants to come on television, and he can come on for as much as 5 or 6 hours, and that the shows are really very, very interesting to watch. They are tremendously entertaining and theatrical, but they're very long, and so this particular cable channel was just taken off the air because it refused to do this, and this
Well, it had a
resulted
bit of a
in
history
protests.
of being anti-Chavez, didn't it?
It was anti-Chavez, and so he decided to finally clamp down on it. But it's been going on for some time. He's been systematically closing down different media outlets for a number of years, but it's not just the media. I mean, there's high inflation. Their economy is completely dependent on oil, of course, and the oil prices are down. So what he did was recently devalue drastically the bolivar, their currency, so that because he gets paid for oil in dollars, so then he can spread this money around in his welfare
More bolivars
programs.
for his petrodollars.
Right, but the crime's very high. They're rolling blackouts all over the country despite their significant energy resources. So, and there have been a number of resignations of senior officials, including his vice president. So it looks like we're at a tipping point, and it should be an exciting year.
Well, Robert, he really was sort of the epitome of a leftward shift throughout the region, and enjoyed substantial popularity by the left-leaning governments for a time. And how has his stock fared on the broader Latin American market?
Yeah, I'd say his stock has declined. That Brazil is the model for a kind of a stand against total American hegemony and the direction of the free trading setup in terms of the whole world, but for more centrist than Chavez. So I think that he still has allies, but the bloom is off the rose to some degree. But the thing of it is that the American right is just chomping at the bit for him to go down. And so there's just story after story, and all this concern about human rights violations, no such concern about other countries that we might work with more closely that have similar violations of free speech and human rights. So the American coverage of it is very ideological. Look, it's a country that is dependent upon one commodity, and that's a very unstable basis for any economy. And whether you had Chavez or a right-wing dictatorship or a very weak democracy, you would still have these same sort of economic problems. There are a lot of economic mistakes about how they've invested in the oil infrastructure. You might have that Chavez or no Chavez, but he's becoming more isolated. He's not as isolated as Castro became ultimately, but certainly a lot of the American major corporations and the right would like to get him isolated in that way. I think that quite frankly, he might have a lot more staying power than people imagine. There's a notion that because the poor are being hurt by the economy, they will therefore turn against him. I'm not sure that's the case. He doesn't have very strong opponents, and he has control of the apparatus of the state. So this might go on, but he's certainly not some great model for a new third way right now, regardless of whether he stays in power.
Well, John, what about that? I mean, what is the state of the opposition? I mean, is there any cohesive force that can challenge him at this point?
None that I could find. Rounding off what Robert said about the state of his state within the country, he has dropped below 50% in terms of opinion polls and popularity. Whether or not that does become enough with the increasing inflation and the price of petrol and the electrical grid issues and the Cold War with Colombia, which we didn't mention up to this point, is that enough to tip it over? I don't know. Right now, he has lost a lot of credibility outside of the country as well. I mean, he criticized the United States military for going into Haiti and helping with the rescue efforts there. Only Cuba and who was it? Cuba, Nicaragua came out and supported one other country as well. So but there was a very limited amount of support for him.
Well. So what about that? Could popularity ultimately not matter if he's willing to just drop any pretense of legitimacy and be a strong man?
Well, that's what he said he's going to do, essentially, and he's recently declared he's a Marxist. and he's going to, and that he needs to work against the capitalist structures that are within his country to fundamentally go beyond his own revolution to yet another revolution. And he has the instruments at hand that he needs. So the question is, will he be successful in that? He's had to move away from some of his rhetoric that, that placed him as such a man of the people and all in order to position him this way. But of course, he's assuming all this Marxist, now revolutionary rhetoric. So it's just a new phase.
Well, John, maybe we can jump over the pond to one of your favorite bailiwicks and the EU. The Obama administration has announced they will not be participating in the EU summit. There are the official reasons, and there's probably the reality and something in between. So what do you think's going on here?
It's a puzzler. It really is. I mean, rarely do we see diplomatic flaps like this blowing up between allies. This should have been taken care of behind the scenes. The spokesman's definitions that this wasn't on the president's calendar or that he was never intending to go, they're almost silly, that the way in which it's being handled. There are issues. I mean, the European Union has been lukewarm in terms of its support for our support that we've looked from them for Afghanistan. They are a little muddled right now in terms of their own leadership. They have elected a president, but they still have rotating presidents, and they haven't quite sorted out how this all goes on, but that shouldn't be the issue. Europe is not as important to us as it was with the rise of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Thank you. Europe isn't as important as it was. The president is preoccupied with jobs in the domestic economy, but this is only a couple of days, and it's not that important a conference. I mean, I can't remember ever reading anything about it. It's just one of those things that goes on. It's the kind of information sharing thing. So I don't know. I think it's much to do about nothing in this particular case.
Well, Robert, how do you read this? I mean, this was an intentional snub or just an overcrowded domestic agenda?
I think probably the root of it is that he has been seen as too focused on the rest of the world because he's done a world tour since being elected, and now if he does not seem serious about the jobs crisis, that 2010 election is going to be very bad for his party. And so it was more about that, but the way it was handled has caused unnecessary diplomatic problems in Europe, and it only is a couple days, so it seems like there should have been some sort of way for him to fly in for a day and done some meet and greet and then gotten out.
He went on the Olympics for a day.
Right, that's what I was
So, and I know they gave as a pretext that there's a row, but whether it should be in Brussels or Spain, and the Spanish are being heavy-handed about making sure that it's in Spain. But nonetheless, I mean, he could have made an appearance, I would think.
I think they'll probably have, they'll do it in November whenever the NATO conference is going to be in Lisbon, and it will all blow over. And my own Zapatero in Spain is upset, but he has other things to be worried about because there's very high unemployment there, and he's got the same kinds of problems that Obama has. And so I think it'll blow over. But I think it's just another sign of the Obama administration's sort of learning curve. First, now we're past the first year, but sort of shouldn't have happened, but it did.
Well, as always, there's plenty more going on than was on our plate initially, so I'd like to give you each an opportunity. We've got just a couple minutes left. What are some other stories we should be watching?
Well, Ukraine elections. There's no question that the Orange Revolution is over in the Ukraine. I mean, it's a result of internal squabbling and economic difficulties. Whoever wins is likely to be much closer to Moscow than to Washington. There are going to be issues. There'll probably be demonstrations.
Dan?
Missile defense is coming to Romania, and they've decided that they're going to participate and allow missile interceptors to be based there along with the Czech Republic and Poland.
Instead of the Czech Republic and Poland?
No, I think it said along with, yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, all the details haven't come out, but the initial news report said that Russia is likely to view this as less offensive than the Czech Republic and Poland one, which it doesn't all make sense to me, but it's interesting to watch.
Robert.
Well, it's hard to top a back to Reagan, Star Wars in Romania tip, but I would say Uganda trying to impose a death penalty for homosexuality, inspired by right-wing Christian groups from the United States. It's begun to get a lot of play in this country, and it begins to show, well, we have our extremists in this country, as we know, and they can hook up with other extremists in other countries like Uganda, but this has gone on for a couple of months now. It's beginning to become an issue in the United States. President Obama has spoken out about it just this week, so that's something to watch as well.
And sort of what is the policy response available to the U.S. in a situation like this?
Well, I don't know if that there's a specific diplomatic response, except to try to perhaps this can move us towards other reforms, such as repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But I suppose we would, if they really did this, we really should consider sanctions and other what we would consider any other human rights emergency in another country. But they've not, as I understand, they haven't passed a law yet. They're trying to pass the law in Uganda, so it's not. But it could be policy very quickly.
We haven't executed anybody yet, have we?
Right, not yet. So do we have to wait for the execution? Okay.
Well, one topic I won't put you on the spot for is your Super Bowl picks. So with that, I will thank you for your help with these topics. And to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.